So this is the final session working on this furniture item for IMVU. So previously we had been painting the textures using Blender rather than an image editor. So at the bottom we have the texture editor, 3D view, where we are looking at our object with the textures assigned. So we have the stool in the editor right now. So we can select through the textures that we painted. So book 2, which is the blue book, and then book 1, which is the green book. So now that we have our textures, these were saved as TGA. So what we're going to do is resave these as PNGs from within Blender. We'll then export the project and then assemble it or reassemble it in IMVU Studio. So, as mentioned, we have our textures painted. All we need to do, image menu, save as. We get the usual fire dialog where we need to save our file. So we have our file name, file location, but we want to change the file format from Targa, which it is at the moment, to, so we're resaving PNG. So there's PNG. We can disable compression. We don't necessarily need that. And then just click Save as Image. So click on that. It'll resave the image. Select our other images. Do the same thing again. So Image, Save As. Change the format. Disable compression. Save As. And then the final one, stool. Save as PNG and save. So just a quick recap before we do this. So we started the project and created our custom pose using the toolkit to create an avatar pose using the animation tool. So this is what we created. And what we dropped into the scene were what we've just been painting. Some basic mesh objects that act as a reference, a physical reference for the avatar to pose against, because otherwise we're posing, essentially we're guessing how the pose, the avatar, is going to interact with whatever objects we might want the pose to be used with. So the objects were placed relative to the avatar. So that basically means that we've used the avatar's origin point, which is at Blender's grid center location. This is essentially where the avatar spawns, to use that word. So the pose is made, or the avatar is positioned relative to this point. And that basically means that anything that the avatar has to interact with needs to be positioned relative to that spot. So the origin, the effective origin of the furniture item, is at the base of the furniture item. But in order to create a functional pose, we have to position these objects relative to the avatar, not the furniture item. So once we've got all that set up, we're then able to export our pose, which we created. So that's a second FBX file, TikTok sitting brackets 4. But once we've done that, we can then create a furniture project, which is what we did, which allows us to drop in furniture nodes or seat nodes that are relative to our furniture as an object. So we've got the furniture item positioned relative to itself. So its origin is now on grid center, and the avatar's origin has now been offset to compensate. So what we did to do that, or to ensure that those are correct, is we just basically exported or appended the furniture objects and the origin point. We used a reference object, a seat reference, so we dropped in an empty, in this case it was just a cube, and that was locked onto or positioned at the poses origin point. So we exported these as a group to maintain the correct relationships between the meshes and the avatar pose, or where the avatar will appear. So that was brought into our furniture project file, and then we positioned everything relative to the furniture item. So now that we've got all of the textures painted, we can export this. So let's go into our TikTok 3D layout. So this is what we've got. So we've got our furniture objects. They've all got their materials assigned. So these are our materials. Book 1, Book 2, and the seat. So if we go into shading, there are our materials. So stool, Book 1, Book 2, and the stool. Just to make sure that that's active, so that's a single user. So the data is saved to the file. So export. TikTok 3D, we need the toolkit. So N key. We need to double check before we do that everything is where it needs to be, and that is inside furniture export, and it is because this was just a continuation of a previous export test. So there's our seat, our books, and the avatar nodes. So this forms the skeleton that the furniture item needs. So 3D, we don't necessarily need to select everything. So let's select none, because all the items that need to be exported are in the export folder. So the toolkit will automatically export everything that's in there. So we don't necessarily need to select anything. So that's all our objects. Everything else is okay in the toolkit because we had that previously set up. So all we need to do now is click on export. That will export an FBX that we can now bring in to IMVU Studio. So in IMVU Studio, we can do one of two things. We can either update an existing project. So this was our previous test. We can either update our project and import the file that we've just exported, because essentially nothing has changed from the point of view of the skeleton. So the skeleton that enables, let's view that. So view skeleton. Let's switch the inventory to the dark room so that we can see the skeleton more easily. So there we can see the skeleton. So that hasn't changed, but what has are the meshes and obviously the materials, the textures that have been assigned. So we can do one of two things. We can either update this or create a new one. So if we were updating, import our FBX, find our file, which will be prepended fern, F-U-R-N. There it is. So select, open, go through the import process, so that's what it's found. Set up FBX. So we need to replace the existing meshes, so book 1 mesh ID 0 to mesh ID 1 and seat mesh ID 2. Make sure those are enabled. Next. There are our materials. Mouse over just to double check. Next. No animation, review. So that's what it's going to bring in and override the existing. And there it is, as simple as that. So that is essentially our completed project saved over a previous test version. So if we look at our components, we've got our material, so book 1, book 2, and the stool. That's our image. So we're selecting each of the materials to expose its properties and then clicking on the image, the thumbnail, to get the panel. So the order the meshes are loaded in as using the mesh IDs doesn't necessarily matter so much as we are overriding any existing meshes. So if seat was originally mesh ID 0 instead of 2, it'll override whatever is in that slot, and we'll still end up with a functional furniture item or a functional set of meshes. So we just need to make sure that we are using the same mesh IDs for all the meshes. So there's the mesh ID in the properties panel. So we're selecting the meshes, and each one will have a different set of properties relative to itself. Skeleton, that will generally always be the same, because in this case we just brought in the meshes, not necessarily the skeleton. But if it does change in the properties, we can change the asset to make sure that it's using the correct skeleton for the product type. In this case, it's a furniture item. There were no animations or no actions aside from the seat, so we use the existing skeleton. So if we enable skeleton again, we use the existing skeleton and just overrode the meshes. But similarly, if we brought in a skeleton again and it was causing issues, we would just need to double check the skeleton to make sure that the action was linking or using the correct skeleton. And then the action, so this was a custom seat node, so stance.custom spot, that would then ensure that that would be correctly triggered because it was latching on to the correct skeleton. Then of course we've got our ensemble, so we want to edit that, have a look at that, configure. So there are the properties for our custom seat pose, static pose. So all we'd need to do now is save, and then in info we change our product information before we submit. So let's change the photo. Let's try zooming. So it was floor originally, 150% zoom. Let's select that one. Select. That sets that as the icons. Bookstool, that's okay. Profit, that's okay. One last save. And then submit. So, as this was previously submitted, we basically used the same project and updated it. It's giving us this message. And what we want to do in this instance is submit as new, because we want to keep the original submission because that reflects the state of the project at that point in time. So submit as new. So we need to set a name. Let's call this TikTok stool. And then just submit. So that's going through the submission process. Submission was successful. Okay. And then it goes to the product page where we submit for publication. So if we were doing this as a new project, so we updated an existing one, we can either go back to the home screen and click on the create button, or we can click on the little plus button in the corner, either or, create. We want rooms and furniture, furniture, empty furniture item. Select. There's our preview. Derive. So it's going to load in the empty scene with our avatar based on our inventory. So all we need to do now is import our project files. So this has a custom pose. So ideally what we want to do here is import the pose first. That was prepended pose. Pose TikTok sitting. It's this one. So select, open, go through the import process. So set up FBX. There's no meshes, nothing here. We don't need to worry about that. No materials. There is our animation. Review, that's what it's going to bring in, import. So it's brought it in, but obviously because there's no furniture item in the scene, it's not going to do anything. But what we can do, now that we've got our assets in place, we can go into component and set up our action, new action, and what this will do, so there's our action. So we need to edit the properties. What this will do is, if we set this up before we import the furniture item and get everything set up for the pose, when the furniture item is imported, Studio will recognize the components of the furniture item and automatically assemble everything without us necessarily needing to do any more extra work. So, name trigger, this is the name of the seat node, which in this case is custom spot. Uppercase C, the first letter is always uppercase. That's okay, we don't need to change that. Ensemble. In the asset, we should have our pose, there it is, and in TikTok sitting. So select, set our start frame, end frame, and number of loops. Everything else is okay. Apply, preview, just to get it fixed in place. And then what we want to do is import the furniture file now. So import FBX, same thing again, fern, there it is, open, import process. So again, mesh IDs, we want one of these to be 0 to override the default, which is 0. So let's just go 1, 2, 3, or 0, 1, 2. Next, there are our materials as before when we import it to update. Next, no animations, review. So that's what it's going to bring in. And import. So there is our furniture item, and we should, if we mouse over the seat node, wherever it is, it's automatically put the avatar pose in place. So if we did this the other way around, if we imported the seat node first and then the avatar, what will often happen is that the skeleton will get overridden by the avatar skeleton that's coming in, that's being imported. And this is where, if that happens, we have to make sure that we set the skeleton in asset to make sure that for a furniture item at least it's using root node underscore root or root node.xsf depending on how the furniture item has been exported. And that would then mean that the pose would latch onto the correct skeleton and it would appear. So there's our action, its properties, so it's a single frame sequence, loops forever. We didn't disable gaze, so the avatar can still look around. But that is our project for the furniture item, at least, with the custom pose. Let's expand that a little bit. The custom pose finished with custom textures painted in Blender using texture paint and the toolkit. And again, if we hadn't already done this, file, save as, TikTok stool file. Save. And we'd basically repeat the same process. So info, change the icons, so let's change the icons. It'll use the file name as the product name, set our profit, and then submit. Just save that. So that is our project finally done. So we've created a custom pose against a custom furniture item with custom textures, hand-painted textures, and using the IMVU Toolkit for Blender.